WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and WNST.net. I wish we were talking about the big Texas-Maryland football game here this week and how they're going to give them heck down there in Old College Park this year, but this thing has become quite a mess around the country, I think, for writers. And this guy, my next guest, is a D.C.-based sports writer and writer of all things, actually. I sort of think of him as an old-fashioned journalist and an enemy of the state, along with the rest of us. You can follow him out at Patrick_Hruby. That's Hruby. He's also a UT Austin sports media fellow. And you study this journalism thing here, and boy, it's stories like this Maryland story, and I go back to Len Bias in '86 because I'm a little older, Pat, that, everyone's coming around. Everyone's going to sniff this story out, and I don't know how Maryland is going to survive this over the next 2, 3, 4 years from the football program, but I don't think DJ Durkin can come back and work either.
No, I mean, look, Maryland sports are going to survive. Maryland football is going to survive. There's too much money on the line for that not to happen. There's too many people that want that to stick around not to happen. It's definitely going to be a case where, bad apples are identified and removed. And it does seem from the reporting going on in the athletic department right now that there's a lot of finger pointing. There's a lot of butt covering. That people are all trying to survive the, I guess you could call it a purge that's going to happen, and or get out of there with as good, as golden a parachute as they can. Which is unfortunate. That's what happens when you have, in this case, precipitating incident with Jordan McNair's death, which is terrible on its own and enough to cause a lot of people to lose their jobs. But it does seem as people have been looking into how and why that happened, there's a lot of other problems sort of under the proverbial rock that's been picked up. And the Washington Post and other places have been all over that. And it doesn't seem like necessarily we saw a lot of good management in that athletic department. So people are going to deservedly lose their heads. But yeah, I don't think that means the actual programs are in any kind of danger.
Well, I think it's going to be a couple $100 million worth of damage here before it's all over with for an athletic department that's already mired in debt. That's the money side. But then there's the human side of this, Pat. And when I first got this story a couple weeks ago, my first thing is, how can you be so sloppy in the modern era, right? On the backside of living through bias 32 years ago now, that these things happen in the course of the middle of the day, in the middle of practice, that all the witnesses, all the coaches, the athletic trainers, all train for this, that this is their worst nightmare. This is the one thing that can never, ever happen on their watch, which is the part that sort of boggles my mind at this point, that a coach in an athletic department would have this fall onto their doorstep, that they allowed this to happen on their watch.
Well, let me say two things. First of all, the specifics that we know about Jordan McNair's death are utterly mind-boggling. For all the reasons you just laid out, there was no reason for him to die. He did not have to die. He did not have to have heat stroke in the first place, but heat stroke is also treatable if you treat it immediately. Essentially, if they had taken his temperature and cooled his body off immediately, gotten him into ice baths, which is something that's not a mystery, it's not a secret, this is well understood, it's extremely likely he would still be alive, and fairly likely he would not have any permanent damage either. That's according to medical experts who have looked at the facts of this case that have come out so far. Again, more facts are going to come out. But given that Maryland president has already apologized to the family and said, we take responsibility, we messed up here, it's pretty clear they messed up. Like, usually legally you don't do that unless you absolutely positively have no case to the contrary.
Well, then the Board of Regents goes nuts the second that there is sort of admitted culpability, because that's when the legal eagles come in. And, Billy Murphy's involved here. Obviously, it's a Baltimore family up here. There's just going to be a lot of money, and it's not insurance money. It's going to be like real money from what I understand.
Right. And in this case, look, how could you say there shouldn't be a lot of money? No amount of money can bring back someone's son.
No doubt about it.
First of all. But in terms of, like I said, since this was a completely preventable death, because this was apparently negligence. Again, all the facts have come out, and negligence has a certain legal definition, but in the commonplace definition, from what we've learned, it's pretty clearly that. I find it hard to believe there wouldn't be some sort of extreme punitive damage for this. Not just people getting fired, but the school having to pay out quite a bit of money. That seems, again, it's not going to bring Jordan McNair back, but it seems like sort of the least they can end up doing. There has to be consequences for this kind of tragic, terrible, fatal mistake. Now, I want to get into something else you said earlier about how being blown away this could happen. There is a sense in which you shouldn't be blown away, and that is this happens far too often. I don't know if people are really aware of this, but in major college football, and this has been studied, by the way, since 2000, so between 2000 and 2016, there have been 33 NCAA football players who died playing the sport. 27 of those were not traumatic. And what I mean by that is they weren't hit in the head or have a brain bleed or an aneurysm or broke their neck or had a spleen lacerated. They did not die from a collision actually playing football. They died because essentially they were worked out too hard. They were overexerted in training to play football, much as Jordan McNair was. Essentially, every year, about 2 players in NCAA football, on average, die from stupid, ridiculous, overly difficult workouts, off-season workouts.
Well, the toughness part of this built into this, right? Well, I mean, that's the macho of the game, though, right? I mean, this is what we've been hearing for 50 years. It's become acceptable even when it shouldn't be acceptable, right? Like all of this, the Oklahomas and, all that stuff that is legend of Lombardi and handed down about how tough you are and are you tough enough and we're going to tape you to the goalposts and haze you. I thought we were really far removed from that because I thought that wasn't acceptable anymore because of insurance, because of video cameras, because kids have cell phones, because of the game of phone booth, that the story will get out, that there is this sort of secret society that still exists beyond all of this.
You're right. It's Scott Anderson. He's a trainer at the University of Oklahoma, one of the best guys in the business. He's been there for almost 2 decades. He's the one who those numbers I just mentioned. He studies this. He's published papers on this. He's been banging the drum on this for years and years and years. He calls it the Junction Boys syndrome, which I think is perfect because
Sure.
it harkens back to, I think, those of us who have watched ESPN or read the book, back in the 50s, Bear Bryant, legendary college football coach, before he got to Alabama, when he started at Texas A&M, his very first training camp, he gets like 100-plus guys out into Junction, Texas, in the brutal heat, has these ridiculous, 12-hour-a-day, practice sessions, no water, basically, trying to essentially kill his players. And that got made into a book. It got made into an ESPN movie. It's sort of a mentality that's celebrated. And what it is, you're right. You hit the nail on the head. It's not the idea of working out and training in order to play football, which is how it works in most sports, right? If you're a sprinter, your workouts are geared to running fast, right? If you are a basketball player, your workouts are geared to jumping high and running fast and being able to shoot the basketball. In football, we have this little unique thing where we're not here to work you out to make you better at football. We're going to, quote unquote, make you tough. And we're going to do that by essentially causing you to experience a tremendous amount of pain and suffering and see if you push through it. Now, look, football is a violent sport. There is an element of, in order to win football games, you have to be able to push through pain and suffering. But unfortunately, in football culture, there's also this huge element of going way too far when it comes to that. Not treating it as a sport, not treating a game, pretending it's essentially military boot camp. And by the way, the military has had lots of reforms in the last 10 or 20 years to avoid their own recruits dying during boot camp. The things that happen in college football would not be allowed in the military. But football does have this old school and stupid mentality that you talk about.
Well, I feel at the NFL level, and I cover NFL teams, there's some level of responsibility about all of this stuff to some degree because of the amount of money they have invested, because of the reputation they have invested, because they don't want journalists running around, whether it's Ray Rice punching a wife in an elevator or Corey Stringer, right? And to your point, what happens in the games themselves with the Ryan Shaziers and these, these horrific incidences of, head trauma and concussions, and we're always talking about that around here, that there would be more just on the medical side of what is tough and what is not tough from the trainers, that we can't be killing kids out here, like that can never ever happen. And for Maryland to have it happen, and for no one to really sniff around much most of the summer before the expose came out, and no mea culpas, and them hiding. I guess that's the other part of this. By the way, I want to reset. Patrick Hruby is my guest. He is one of the real journalists out there. At one point was with Vice Sports, now with UT Austin, and the Sports and Media Fellow there. Has done work at ESPN and Washington Times, Sports on Earth, a bunch of places. You can find him out on Twitter at Patrick_Hruby. That's HRUBY. He does a great job out in writing about all sorts of sports issues, but this one specifically. And then there's the cover-up part. Like, this is where the NFL part comes in, where I'm familiar with the sports cover-up of all of this and make the journalists go away. But when it's a state institution, when it's an institution of higher learning down at College Park, that's always kind of feeling its way after bias, I think, with the community of Baltimore and Washington, that no one really owns Maryland. And you live around here. It's not really D.C. school. It's certainly not Baltimore school. I don't know where it is, but always trying to sell more tickets, trying to be bigger and better in the Big Ten. We're going to leave the ACC. All of that goes into this. And then when the media comes knocking, it feels like you're uninvited, and we're going to throw a blanket all over this so we can keep DJ Durkin around here. I don't know what they've been doing the last 3 weeks. That's really been the biggest embarrassment to me as to how all of this has been handled in the aftermath and lawyered up.
Well, I mean, I think that stuff's inevitable, right? And I'm not trying to defend Maryland, but I think that's what you're always going to see. Look, the president of Maryland coming out and saying, this is our fault, is I wouldn't say it's totally unprecedented, but it's very rare in college sports, even when it is very clearly the fault of a school, the fault of a coach, the fault of a strength coach. Like, when there's institutional failure, as there has been in the case of Maryland, it's rare for them just to admit it. Usually they clam up, they say nothing, they release lawyered statements, and they fight in court. And then grudgingly, like on page 60 of some deposition that somebody digs out of a lawsuit, you see them actually admitting it because they're forced to. So I don't want to give kudos to Maryland. I just want to say, like, it's unusual the president would come out and say that, which to me says the facts are really bad and really against Maryland, because they must feel like that's not even an option for them to do. But in terms of, there's a bigger point here. I'm glad you sort of brought up the idea of Terps, which is college sports, and you brought up the NFL comparison too. The NFL is an extremely controlling environment when it comes to information, very deliberately. It's a lot like politics in some ways, where, there's all these PR people working for teams, working in the league, that are trying to, shape, massage, control the message, control what information gets out, control how you, the fans, the constituents, and politics, the voters, think about things. That's just the world we live in. But a lot of those same techniques and that same kind of limits on access have filtered their way down to college sports. And so it's not unusual either for college programs to have this sort of, I don't want to say that they're like, trying to get information out of the Kremlin, but there's a little bit of that feel around a lot of major college programs. They're afraid of the media. They're afraid of, they're legitimately afraid. Sometimes things that aren't really that bad can be blown up into being bad. But also, they've got stuff they want to hide. And
but there's that other thing where they're under that blanket of, we are an institution of higher learning, we're educational, right, we're state-owned, state-funded, right, we're respected, we have integrity, we have all of that. That's different than usually what the NFL says, right? I mean, especially on this anthem issue.
I think that's an argument for we should as citizens and as taxpayers should have more an expectation of transparency from something like Maryland and from something like Maryland sports. I mean, they are a taxpayer-funded institution. They're a state institution. They are not a private business. In my mind, we have more of a right to know, and they have more of an obligation to be open and tell us what's going on with all of these things. Not just, in this case, what's going on in the athletic department, but in general, if there was a scandal in the chemistry department, we should all be able to know about that. It's a public institution. So I do think that's also an issue here. I do think that it doesn't help. I actually think it's one of those things they always say the cover-up's worse than the crime. In this case, it's not worse than the crime, but it doesn't help. It's not helping Maryland to sort of clamp about this. And again, the trickle of stories now, the knock-on stories here, where it's beyond Jordan McNair's death. We're finding, we found out that there seemed to be this really abusive culture that was kind of led by the strength coach and endorsed by the head coach or vice versa. We see that there seems to be some issues with the previous athletic director and sort of people in the department kind of trying to stab each other in the back. And it looks like there was an issue with other football players were accused of sexual assault. And I think it's been reported that it looks like DJ Durkin paid himself for a lawyer for them to get their defense, which seems really weird and probably unethical and wrong. There seems to be a lot of stuff sort of coming out. Even there was a story where the university president, it was proposed to him, hey, we want to basically take some guidance from the NCAA, some guidelines from the NCAA that suggest you should take your team trainers, medical staff, and sort of make them independent so they don't answer necessarily to the athletic department. They don't answer to the coaches in particular. And in this case, the university president seemed like he didn't want that. He didn't want them to have that kind of independence. That could reflect poorly on him. There's a lot of stuff that's sort of going on that's now coming to light. And I think you're right. It'd probably be better for Maryland to just get it out there and deal with it than to have it trickle out.
Patrick Hruby is our guest. He is one of the last great journalists out there. He's a writer, editor, journalist at UT Austin, a sports and media fellow in the biz of journalism. Then the journalism kicks in, right? The journalism is being judged here, right, at this point, and who can get a story first and who can get the truth. And, was there sort of this abusive culture? A lot of the players now playing we're with the coach game, and then they got to go out and play football with Texas, lo and behold, and Michigan and Michigan State and Ohio State, who've had their own problems. This story's not going to go away once the season gets going. And as Maryland takes their lumps, as they usually do in the Big Ten, even in the best of circumstances, this story's not going to go away, and it's going to keep getting dredged up every week, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I wouldn't even call it being dredging up. It's going to keep unfolding. I mean, this is a big deal. Someone died who didn't have to die. So, that's a huge deal. And, I think, the next part of the story and the important part is beyond, people who are responsible facing consequences for this is how do you make sure this never happens again? And the good news here, and I say that with a lot of sadness, is that we know how to make sure this doesn't happen again. Like I said at the beginning, this is a preventable death. This does not ever have to happen. No Maryland football player ever has to die again from working out too hard. There's a lot of good, again, I'm not an exercise scientist, but there's a lot of good exercise science out there on how to get people into proper off-season workouts in terms of what kind of temperature you should be working out in, what kind of workouts are appropriate for what level of shape you're in, what position you play, your body mass, how fit you are, any kind of pre-existing conditions that we should be screening you for. And then on the back end of it, there's also what do you do if something goes wrong? Like in Jordan McNair's case, if you have the symptoms of heat stroke, you take your temperature, you find out they're way too hot, and you get them into an ice bath immediately. Again, there's sort of the front end, don't do stupid workouts in the first place. And the back end, even if you do that and something still goes wrong, you also are prepared. And those are things that, again, we know how to do it. It's not a mystery. We need to make sure that Maryland and everywhere is doing that. We need to make sure, for instance, trainers and medical people are completely independent so that if you have the bad luck to get a coach who thinks this is a good idea or a strength coach who thinks, screw those safety rules, we got to be tough if we're going to be able to compete against Michigan, that the trainer and the doctor can say, no, you're not going to do that. This is over. This is done. And not feel like they're going to lose their job. That's also a big problem. Some of the reporting in this story, again, I haven't done the reporting, I can't confirm it, but, it's come from good sources, has basically suggested that Maryland's athletic trainer used to be a lot more sort of in tune with protecting the athletes and looking out for their health, but under Durkin and under the strength coach court, became a lot more sort of in line with what they wanted. And you know what? If his job depends on how the coach and the strength coach look at him and feel like he's on the same page with them, you can see how you might change. It's easy to get people to do something when their paycheck depends on it. So I think that's another piece of the puzzle here. The school has to put in rules and enforce rules that make sure it doesn't happen again.
Patrick Hruby is our guest. He is Patrick_Hruby out on Twitter and writing about all things sports and lots of politics involved in there as well. And I guess the intersection of all that begins next week with players and knees and national anthems. And certainly the owners have done everything they can do to keep these guys standing, whether they want to or not, including blackballing football players. I mean, I am amazed that this Kaepernick thing and the Reed thing have played out the way they've played out and have been allowed. I'm almost shocked that the players go out and play. I'm not being facetious. I know there's a lot of money out there, but this is an incredibly divisive issue. The guy who's been the president, it appears he's still going to be the president next week, although I think that's day to day, at any point around here as well.
I like that.
Yeah, it's day to day.
Right.
We can only hope. But at this point, this is not going to go away, and guys are going to take the knee, and ESPN's going to get involved, the league's going to get involved, journalists are going to get involved, Kaepernick, Reed, all of these. This is about to get sort of regurgitated all over again next week because it won't take much to get off of football and back onto the flag again.
This is the thing: is the NFL could not have possibly handled this worse. And look, this is a tricky thing to handle because the overlap. You do a Venn diagram, right? The two circles and where they overlap. If you took people who love NFL football and people who basically just are going to get upset at anybody doing anything during the national anthem, there's a pretty one-to-one overlap there, right? The same thing, there's an overlap between people who love the NFL and people who are Trump's base, right? There's a lot of overlap there. But the NFL's problem, in part, the politics of this, and I say politics, I don't mean Republican, Democrat, I mean just the sort of politics of it, is the NFL doesn't just appeal to Trump's base voters. It has to appeal to a very wide variety of Americans. So I think that explains some of their floundering and their flopping around on this, where they can't get a consistent policy. They can't figure out what to do. They keep knee-jerk reacting to whatever Trump tweets or Trump says at a rally. He keeps beating them up because it's advantageous for him politically. It gets his base excited, right? Trump's never gone wrong, essentially. If Trump is having a bad day in the press for all the various reasons that are well documented every single day, if he's having a bad day with his administration, he can always insult a black person and make his base happy. We've seen that pretty consistently. It seems to work pretty well. And I think also, this is another reason why I think the NFL struggle with this, is the NFL, in a way, has been so successful in terms of keeping its players sort of under the owner's thumb, beating them up in CBA negotiations, giving Roger Goodell all this sort of unaccountable power to discipline players, that in some ways, it's when you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail problem. The NFL office and owners, I feel like anytime there's a problem with players, their first thought is squash the players. That will make the problem go away. And in this case, that was the worst possible thing. Can you imagine if after Colin Kaepernick's first protests became a national story, and by the way, no one even noticed it at first. It took a little while for people to notice he was doing that because he wasn't trying to make a gigantic thing out of it. He was doing something out of sincere conviction. If the NFL had just sat down with Colin Kaepernick and been hey, you know what? This could be a problem for all of us, but we also want to hear about what you are trying to say, your message, which his message is not, I hate the flag. His message is, we need to be aware of and do something about unaccountable police violence against minorities in this country, which is something that very few people, some people, that makes them mad. And they just don't believe that's a real problem. And even if they think it's a real problem, they don't actually think there should be anything done about it. But I think the majority of Americans are probably yeah, we don't want cops shooting and beating up innocent people. That's not good. Even if I'm not the same race as the people it's happening to. I think a lot of people would get on the same page with that. If the NFL gone to Kaepernick and said, what can we do to sort of promote this message? We'll work with you. You know?
Well, the embarrassing part of all this is how Jerry Jones went out and started kneeling and standing, and the Ravens tried to do a prayer and trying to use the knee for one thing. Hell, Ray Lewis was on 2 knees talking about praying while he was protesting.
But at that point, they didn't even know what they were protesting or why. The NFL tried to just co-opt it to defang it. They tried to co-opt it to, the NFL tried to make like a statement of unity against Donald Trump pushing them around, which is not the same thing. They didn't address the actual issue. Look, the NFL is not going to solve police violence against minorities in America, but if the NFL players are concerned about that, and they want to make a statement about that, and they want the public to think about that, which is what Kaepernick was trying to do and the other players that followed are trying to do, instead of being confrontational and telling them no and treating them like misbehaving children, which is what the NFL league office always does with its own players, it doesn't treat them like partners, it doesn't treat them like adults. They should have done that. They should have generally worked them. They shouldn't have gotten to the point where the only time they tried to work with them is when it was too late and it looked like they were essentially trying to bribe them to make a problem go away.
Well, and they were in mid-flight as well.
The NBA found a way to do it. Look, the NBA has a rule, like you can't do this, but you know what the NBA doesn't do? The NBA encourages players, if you want to wear I Can't Breathe t-shirts, wear them. If you want to use a platform to make these statements, like we're behind your right to do that, and we're going to encourage you to do that. So the NBA very smartly worked with its players to take it away from the anthem part of it and focus on the actual thing being protested part of it. And everyone kind of won there. And I think it was easier for the NBA for 2 reasons. One, the NBA actually has a much more respectful relationship with its players. They're much more of peers. Their negotiations aren't nearly as contentious. They don't treat all NBA players like people they have to keep under their thumb and misbehaving children. And the second thing I think that helps was, the NBA's audience also is a lot more diverse. So when you're talking about...
And international as well.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. But, I'm just saying now, this goes back to actual politics stuff. But, yeah, look, if your audience is more diverse, right, it's more liberal, it's more people of color in it, that audience is going to be more receptive to a message of we need to stop unaccountable police violence against minorities than a more conservative, red state kind of audience is going to be, where the default reaction is going to be like, this isn't a problem, blue lives matter too. Then you get into the political debate we see at the bigger level in this country. So it was easier for the NBA to do that, but they were also much smarter about it, and the NFL really should have tried to do that.
Dude, love having you on. I appreciate you making times a couple times a year to come on and tell me about the UT Austin Sports Media Fellow and all that stuff. What are you up to lately, man?
So UT Austin has this great sports journalism, sports media, sports communication program. I'm a fellow in it. It's really fun. I go out there. We have screenings of documentaries. We have panels of filmmakers and athletes. We talk about these social and sports issues. We talk about how they're covered. It's a great program. I love getting out to Austin. It's a great place. There's tons of smart people. I learn something every time. Tons of great students. It's really fun to talk to them about the business. I can't say enough about it. If there's, if the 1% of your audience out there if there's younger people out there that are thinking about getting into journalism, and you're thinking about actually going to school for it, it's a great place to consider. You have to give them a little plug. I would say that even if I wasn't affiliated with them. Yeah, exactly.
But you get beer and barbecue thrown in too with Austin. So
I didn't get to that. That's the other part. It's great to visit Austin. It's tremendous barbecue. I won't name any names because no one's paying me to endorse them. But you actually really can't go wrong, especially coming from DC. I go out there and everybody out there has their own favorite barbecue place. And I always tell them, it's like, dude, this is all amazing to me. I can't tell the difference because it's all so good. You who live here and eat it all the time, you can split hairs about what's better. To me, I'll take it all.
Dude, I'm from Maryland. We're a crustacean state up here, So, we got crabs. They do barbecue. So,
No. I'm not going there to eat crab cake. That's for sure.
Oh, no doubt about it. Everybody's got their regional thing going on. Maybe one day you and I will share an adult beverage down in D.C. Pat, I appreciate the time, as always. We're following you out there on Twitter and everywhere you're writing about the good stuff in the world, and I do appreciate the time. Thanks for coming on, pal.
Great. Thanks for having me. Take care.
Patrick Hruby, that's Patrick _HRUBY, writer, editor, journalist, a UT Austin sports media fellow, also a former Georgetown professor. And I found his work at Vice Sports, which I enjoy as well. You can find him out on Twitter reporting on all the good stuff, the juice in the sports and the journalism and the business and the politics and where it all intersects, which is why I dug Vice and still dig Vice. Nasty at WNST.net can find me anytime, anywhere. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, also out in the buyatoyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn radio app. We do come in crystal clear from anywhere in the world. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.